Dr. Ralph Piedmont, welcome to the MindStew podcast.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Joshua, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to speak with you and your audience today.
Perhaps we could start just with a bit of a general overview. How do you describe what you do, and I guess briefly how you got there?
Okay. Well, by training, I am a personality psychologist. I got my PhD in psychology in 1988 from Boston University. After which I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institute on Aging with doctors Costa and Robert McCrae, who are two of the big leaders in the five-factor model of personality. After that, I did a quick little stint as director of research for a employment assessment firm in Princeton, and then came back down here to Maryland to take up a position at Loyola University in Maryland, teaching in their pastoral counseling program. So I've always been a big personality psychologist. The Big Five was a very important educational experience for me, because what it did, it really gave me a great foundation in what was at that time the up and coming model of personality, the five-factor model, as we know. And the five-factor model has been my professional organizing rubric for everything that I've been doing since then. I've been exploring the Big Five in terms of its comprehensiveness and including other models of personality. I've done cross-cultural research with it, extending the value of the model to other languages and cultures. We've looked at clinical implications of the Big Five, especially in the area of personality disorders. And another area that we've looked at has been what lies beyond the Big Five. Is the Big Five all that there is, or could there be other dimensions? Some of my research has led me to discover the numinous, which I've argued as being the sixth major dimension of personality. So that's essentially who I am and what I do.
Yeah, that sets the scene really nicely.
Great.
Perhaps we can dive into the numinous, which is a term that you use, as I understand, basically synonymous with spirituality.
Yes.
So if there is an important distinction there, could you draw that distinction? But then
Absolutely.
also, I'm curious as to why personality is a useful approach to spirituality.
Sure.
Yeah, whether you could outline that for us.
I hope I can. Well, first of all, if I can, with your viewers, I have a new book out. If I may, can I put in a plug for the book? Would that be inappropriate?
No, sure, and we'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, it's called Understanding the Psychological Soul of Spirituality, a guidebook to research and practice, published in 2020 by Routledge Press. Basically, it has 30 years of my research all summarized right in here in a very organized way. One of the interesting things, when I started at Loyola, it was a pastoral counseling program that tried to use spirituality as a component to therapeutic endeavors in an effort to help bring about transformation in our clients, more so than just getting over their problems, but also helping to transform how they see and view themselves in life. Religion and spirituality has become a very popular concept in the last 30 years. For a long time, and there's still today some tension between mainstream science and theology, and the reasons for that are very broad, very complex, and go back way in time. So my issues, what I've been trying to do is that as I've done research in this area, I've noticed there's a lot of pushback to the term religion and spirituality. It harkens things about theological perceptions. We have to be careful that science doesn't become a shill for religion. It's a very complex area that brings in a lot of entangling influences. And a lot of times it's an off-putting reality in the sense that I'm studying religion and spirituality. But what if you're an atheist? How do you fit into that? If I do spiritually integrated therapy and you're an atheist, does that mean that you're not entitled to the benefits of this point of view, that somehow you're defective, broken, lacking something because you're not religious? That's a problem. Another problem is, whose religion are we talking about? In the United States, it's very common to take a mainline Protestant point of view. which is of the large majority of people in the United States. But if you're Jewish, Islamic, Hindu, or any one of the thousands of other non-Western religions, how do you fit into this? So my view was to say, I am not a theologian, I'm a psychologist. And although religion is important and valuable, and it defines the human species in terms of who we are, because every group of man over every age period, religion and spirituality has been a key focus to their society. So it's something important about us. But I wanted to take a very specific psychological perspective. I don't want people to confuse me that I'm a shill for religion or I'm pushing. I want to know, basically, my question is this: what is it about us psychologically that makes religion and spirituality so important to us? That is strictly a psychological concept. And that's where the numinous comes in. I picked the word numinous because it's not spirituality and religiousness, but it's a term that does have both a spiritual and also a psychological pedigree to it. If you're familiar with the work of Erik Erikson, you notice in his stages of development, stage one is trust versus mistrust. Now, for Erikson to positively resolve a stage, one had to come across enough positive resolutions to the ego challenges in order to, it's like a 51-49% split. You can get that 51%, you've successfully navigated that stage. And one of the positive outcomes for trust versus mistrust is the numinous. And what the numinous is, it's this healthy feeling of awe and amazement to the beneficence of some larger reality or power that's there. From Erikson's point of view, a child experiences the numinous when the mother comes and essentially rescues the child from loneliness, from being fearful, from hunger, and provides for the child's needs for succorance and care and love and warmth. And that creates a very special bond between the child and the parent and the caregiver. And that special bond is what Erikson has talked about as the numinous. And it's a very special feeling that also generalizes, I believe, to our encounter with some transcendent reality, however we may define that. In that we always look at things like the night sky, or we look at a picture of like the Grand Canyon. People feel awed by that. They recognize how small they are in relation to these beautiful, huge processes of nature and life. And we recognize that there's larger things going on, that we are all connected in some process and pattern of life as it grows and unfolds over time. And that becomes our spiritual sense, as I understand it. And what the numinous really becomes, we begin to understand our lives outside of the immediacy of the time and space of our existence. We think about ourselves through time and even in time spans beyond who we are. Movies like The Gladiator, I don't know if you saw that movie with Russell Crowe. Again, the key line in that whole movie was the things that we do today reverberate into eternity. That's a spiritual idea. That's the concept of infinitude, that we understand our lives today as basically one step in a larger ontological process that goes well beyond our lifetimes. So that's where our spirituality comes in. And as people begin to understand themselves from this perspective, they start building more resilience into their lives, more meaning, purpose, direction, and an inner sense of integration that's very hard to be disturbed by problems that may prop up in people's immediate lives. So it is a very powerful force. And the opposite side of that, which is, we call it existential crisis, where we don't have that transcendence, where we become so focused on us and the here and now that we lose that perspective, can result in a tragic sense of existential crisis and vacuum that is very, very hard to manage. And what some of the research that I've done has shown that this notion of existential crisis, or what I call religious crisis, spiritual crisis, or a lack of worthiness, is an independent predictor of mental illness over and above whatever neuroticism contributes. And neuroticism is one of the major predictors of mental illness today. But the lack of worthiness is an additional risk factor for developing personality disorders, axis 1 disorders, and just a larger sense of tragedy in people's lives.
Yeah, again, I think that's a great overview. And if I understand right, the core of the numinous from a personality perspective then is something around an identification just with ourselves as an individual versus
Well,
as a
it
part of
actually
a
is,
larger
yeah, there you go.
yeah
It'll be
process
just
as
the
well.
opposite of that.
Yeah,
We have,
that spectrum.
right, there's three major concerns that human beings have. And the numinous addresses those three concerns. The first concern, or fear, a lot of my ideas work out of this theologian, Paul Tillich. He's got a great book called The Courage to Be. I recommend everyone read that because it's right on target. But there's three major fears that we have. First, is death the end? When I die, does everything I have come to an end? Well, that's a really, there's a whole field in psychology called terror management that concerns itself with that question. What do people do when you stress their mortality? Well, it freaks us out. It's what happens. But again, it's the issue, is death the end? The second question that we have is life chaos? Is there a meaning and purpose built into life? And if you look at some of the classic existentialists, when they said that life has no meaning, next thing they do is terminate their lives, which is, again, an existential crisis, that there's no meaning or purpose for me, then why the hell am I here? And then finally is the issue of, am I good enough? Am I a worthy enough person? I mean, I am who I am. I have my flaws, I have my weaknesses, but overall, am I good enough? Is what I'm doing acceptable? Am I a good person? It's a key question. In fact, Saving Private Ryan, have you seen that movie? Okay,
Yeah.
again, at the end of the movie, when our protagonist is the old man, he's with his family at the cemetery in Normandy there. Again, he looks at, he's talking to the dead captain, and he asks his wife, tell me I'm a good man. Tell me I'm worthy. I mean, that's a key existential quality about us, that are we really good enough? So those three issues are the key aspects of the numinous. And our response to those things is the numinous motivations that we have. And the three motivations that are part of the numinous are infinitude, which concerns helping us to live a life of meaning and value, even though we know at some point we're going to die. It's meaning, obviously, it stands for itself. And then finally, worthiness, which is seeing ourselves as I understand the world to be. Am I a good person in that world, or am I being condemned by that world? And feeling condemned creates a profound sense of emptiness and despair that's very hard to overcome.
Yeah, those three motivations make sense, and I totally understand how they're things that would inevitably get people to be concerned with the numinous in some sort of way. But as you were saying that, I was thinking as well, people have a capacity for profound spiritual experiences,
Oh,
sort of
absolutely.
mystical experiences that are
Absolutely.
reported in the literature. Um,
Absolutely.
how do you make sense of them? Because I could imagine that the numinous as something important just from that sort of from those motivations that you said, without this capacity for profound experiences.
Absolutely. Before I answer that, I just have to put a little foundation to that. Number one, these three motivations are strictly psychological in nature, okay? Which means that they're universal to all human beings. And as I've shown in my research, my measure of like the numinous motivation inventory is reliable and valid with believers and non-believers. It works with Jews, Christians, Muslims, Asian faiths, New Age faiths. Everybody has these qualities inside of them. So it's a universal. And if you look at it, all major religions explicitly address those three motivations, right? There's a life after death, that's infinitude. God has a plan for you, there's meaning. And if ultimately you think you fouled up in some catastrophic way, there's always the possibility, divine forgiveness. Okay, so religions are designed to directly address those motivations. Now, again, where do all these mystical experiences come from? Well, they come from a number of different places. Some of the mystical experiences that people have are like a learned experience. You know, in our culture, we learn what spirituality is about. Okay, people aren't born Jewish, they're not born Catholic. They're born with a numinous sensibility, but their culture will determine how that motivation becomes expressed and actualized in their real behavior. So we learn to be spiritual from a Christian perspective, or from a Jewish perspective, or from a Hindu perspective. So we learn the specifics of these mystical experiences, from our culture. But given the fact that these numinous motivations are inside of us, that they're part of who we are, naturally sets us up to the potential for us to being, picked by these little reminders of something broader to our lives. People sometimes say that when they have their first child, and you look at that brand new baby for the first time, this is part of you. This is your future. All of a sudden, we're thinking in a whole new perspective now that goes beyond just me. It's my child and my child's children. Then I start worrying about those things. That's infinitude. So, and having the motivations makes these things possible. Everybody is likely to have some type of mystical experience because it's part of who we are. In fact, I claim that the numinous is one of those psychological qualities that defines the human species. And if you think about that for a second, can you name any other psychological quality that is uniquely human? Okay, not something that we do better than other animals, like let's say language. Okay, a lot of animals do language. We just happen to do it a lot better than everybody else. But can you think of another uniquely human psychological quality? Yeah,
No.
it's a tough one. I know of only one other one. And the only other uniquely human psychological quality, schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a uniquely human disorder. There's no animal models to schizophrenia. We can't create it in an animal, any other animal. So it's uniquely ours. And what's interesting about that is that schizophrenia is a cognitive disorder that really refers to a breakdown in meaning making. So schizophrenia is a breakdown in a person's capacity to make meaning for themselves, to understand themselves as an individual and an entity. And spirituality, or the numinous, I think is the opposite end of that spectrum. It is the capacity to make elaborative meaning, broad-based connections that go well beyond the limitations of my community and physical space and my timeline in my life as well. So I think it's very interesting that this dimension that's out there, it's this like a cognitive dimension of understanding and ultimate meaning making that either fails for us with schizophrenia or becomes highly elaborative and makes us really live a well-integrated life.
I'm glad you brought up schizophrenia because there were two main things that I wanted to talk to you about, and they
Okay.
seemed rather disjointed.
Okay.
But it seems as though we're going to be able to bring them together nicely. Because I'm also really interested in some of the work that you did around a concept that you termed experiential permeability,
Yes. Yeah.
and uh, which I understand was work um, to elaborate the maladaptive expressions of the main personality trait, openness to experience.
Right.
So yeah, perhaps could you explain a bit of the motivation for experiential permeability and what it is, and then we can get into then we can link back up with schizotypy
Absolutely.
again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Um, my work with openness to experience was done. Well, it's interesting. There's the big five. The big five, in my opinion, is probably the most important empirical development in the field of psychology since the introduction of the Yerkes-Dodson law in 1908. Okay, the five-factor model is an empirically robust, universal structure for understanding individual difference constructs that have traditionally been associated with personality in our field. Okay, so we have this big five. It's an amazing model that has tremendous value for our field because it identifies the full spectrum of personality related individual difference traits as traditionally understood by the field. And it's an empirical model, so it's based on data. It's been shown to be generalizable. And it's interesting about the big five in that while the big five really emerged into prominence probably by mid-1990s, it was pretty much there kind of thing. Really, the big five personality traits didn't all emerge at once. Okay, I did a study with one of my graduate students where we got 160 adjectives that had been shown to measure these five factors. And we went to the Oxford English Dictionary, or my student did. And what he did was he looked up each of these adjectives and found the date where that adjective first appeared as a description of personality. And we did this for the 160 adjectives. And then we did a simple one-way ANOVA, the domains being the five factors. And then we looked at date of entry as the dependent variable. And we found a significant age effect in that the oldest personality dimensions were extroversion and agreeableness, which make up our interpersonal style, okay, followed by conscientiousness, and then neuroticism. And then the last one to emerge was openness to experience. So openness is really the newest dimension in our lexical tote bag here. It's in our data around 1750 was the median year for these adjectives coming out. And there was a second mode around 1850, 1860 as well, which is very interesting because that dovetails very nicely with the introduction of the scientific method, okay, and the rise of the Industrial Revolution, where the need for creativity, the need for flexibility became very, very important in our society and culture. And that's when these adjectives started appearing more frequently. So openness is the newest dimension. It's the smallest in terms of word categories. And as such, it's the least well understood in the field. And when you look at the relationship between the big five and the personality disorders, you find that the big five are there, okay, and that we can understand personality disorders as them being more extreme variants of these big five dimensions kind of thing. But the one that's not there, the one factor that's really not in the current set of personality diagnoses is openness to experience. Now, some people have claimed that, well, openness has no pathological correlates to it. Well, that just seems like nonsense, because why would these other four work and not openness? So I thought, and my perspective is that the current nosology of personality disorders is incomplete, okay? And that if you look at the correlations between the 11 disorders and the big five, neuroticism and extroversion are the two heavy predictors of scores on these dimensions. A and C come in distant second and third, but openness is pretty much not there. So that seemed like a real problem. So my goal was to see if openness is another dimension of personality, it must have some maladaptive aspects to it. And what would those maladaptive aspects look like? So that's what started the research on that topic. And what we found was we came up with four scales that came off. Two were for high openness, two were for low openness. So for example, the high openness was, I called one like a schizotypal type of person. People have very little control, so they're very fluid. Think about people on the spectrum, as they say, the ADHD spectrum. A lot of that would be uncontrolled openness coming out. The second scale was what I called the unmitigated libertarian. We had a person here called the Unabomber. I don't know if you came across him in Australia. This was some kind of guy. He lived out in the woods. He was a government employee, got very disgruntled, and he left and he went off the grid, and he was living out in Minnesota or someplace in the woods, and he was sending bombs to people via the mail who were in government. That's my unmitigated libertarian. These are people that don't want to have any rules or regulations imposed on them. They want to live their own personal, unique lifestyle. So that was the second high openness dysfunctional quality. On the low side, we had another two. One was rigidity, uh, which was an interesting topic that somehow got lost between DSM-2 and DSM-3. That rigidity used to be a very important quality for mental illnesses, especially from a psychodynamic point of view. But DSM-3, when it emerged, was much more behavioralistically oriented and really moved greatly away from its psychoanalytic roots, throwing away the authoritarian personality and that type of rigidity and dogmatism. Well, that came out in a heartbeat. People who are very rigid, dogmatic, they're authoritarian, they're fascist in some ways. And then the final group was the alexithymic group. I labeled the alexithymic group. These are people that have nothing to do with emotions or feelings at all. They're very superficial. They like to keep it light and bouncy. And any talk about any emotive topics are actively avoided. So those were the four scales that came out on dysfunctional openness that really gave us a very good sense of that, yes, openness has dysfunctional qualities. And yes, the DSM does not contain any of these dysfunctional qualities. So the question arises, are there potential personality disorders out there that are hitherto unclassified? And given the fact that the most commonly give access to, or personality disorder diagnosis is NOS, clearly there's a lot of people out there who are suffering from characterological impairment that are unable to be classified in the current DSM. And maybe we can reduce that numbers if we're able to put in a series of disorders that are linked to openness to experience.
And why did you term this cluster of work experiential permeability?
Because openness is a dimension that basically talks about how much permeability there exists between the inside you and your outer world of experiences. That if we were to look at a scale like the NEO-PI3, for example, which is the only commercially published measure of the Big Five, you'll see that people high on openness to experience, for example, one of the subscale facet scales is aesthetics. And on the aesthetics scale, it looks at the extent to which people are moved by artistic experiences, whether it's painting, music, dance, or whatever artistic medium that we have. Are they moved by that? And in fact, as Jeff McCrae was saying, part of the response is a physiological response, that people who are high in aesthetics, they'll listen to a piece of music and they'll get goosebumps on their neck, or their hairs will stand up because they're just that moved by those experiences. So events in the outer world really can impact and affect us emotively inside ourselves. We're also open to feelings and emotions, even the hard emotions like anger, even sexuality. We can pull these in and manage them in an open way. Okay, that's the permeability, as opposed to low openness people who become very dogmatic, very rigid, and really, there's not a lot of interplay between what's inside of them and outside of them. There's a lot of, some people can be called over-controlled, a little bit too tightly wrapped is a phrase for somebody who would be low on openness to experience. So the permeability is really an essential feature of what openness is about. It's about our ability to psychologically engage with and be influenced by external events in our environment.
And then so back to schizotypy and schizophrenia, you had the one aspect of maladaptive high openness was around oddness, bizarreness,
Yes, that's it. That's
and a fluidity. Right, right.
absolutely,
And
absolutely. There's yeah.
yeah, so with high openness and high numinosity or spiritual transcendence, you think they're both useful personality angles on schizotypy. Is that right?
Absolutely. But let me just point out that each of the factors, now we talked about the big five, clearly I'm in the big six model. There's the big five plus the numinous. All of these dimensions are independent of one another. Okay, so it's possible that I could be high on the numinous, but low on openness to experience, okay, because they're not related to one another. What's interesting would be somebody who's high on schizotypy, I'm sorry, and is also high on the numinous, especially the infinitive. These individuals may have very vivid and detailed supernatural type experiences. Now, the schizotypy or the odd and unusual person, they tend to go into things like aliens and space beings and all kinds of, little ghosts and goblins and creatures that move bunk in the night. Okay, but the high transcendence person, their engagement is a higher connection to some reality as they define it that is just eternal in nature, to which being part of that gives them a sense of centeredness and contentment that's not really found with the odd and unusual person.
Okay, so if we link back to the sixth big factor,
Sure.
the
Mhm.
numinous one. One question I had when thinking about this as a sixth personality trait was why wasn't it picked up in the initial investigations of personality? Why aren't so? I mean, I understand that there's some initial lexical studies. You take all the descriptors of people. Why isn't
Mhm.
that there in the language? And why wasn't it picked up earlier?
Excellent question. I'm very impressed with you, Joshua. I'm very impressed. Actually, all of the seriously, that's a very good question. It really is. I love it. Um, when the Big Five started, it started in 1936 with Gordon Allport and one of his doctoral students, Odbert, who got his PhD for going to the OED, actually with Webster's Fourth Unabridged Dictionary. And he pulled out every adjective that we use to describe other people. And he came out with a grand total of 17,956 adjectives. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. And the first real systematic work on those adjectives began with Raymond Cattell in the 1940s. Now, Raymond Cattell was really one of the major pioneers in developing factor analysis as a useful statistical tool for psychology. And what Cattell did is that he took, well, he couldn't take all 17,000. What he did is he started off, I believe, with 4,600 adjectives. He himself picked the 4,600 adjectives. Okay, so there was some self-selection process going on there. And that's when he started working off of that for doing his factor analyses that led him to his 16 PF. He found 16 primary dimensions there among the adjectives that he was looking at. He didn't include any spiritual items. Okay, now fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s, the work of Ashton and Goldberg. They went back to some of these adjectives, and what they did is that they pulled out different sets of adjectives than what Cattell used. So they tried to be a little more inclusive. And interestingly enough, they did have terms for spirituality and religiousness were part of their adjectives. And interestingly enough, though in their factor analysis, those items always formed an independent factor in addition to the big five. So if you look in the literature, they're there. When they're used, they pop out as a separate factor. So why wasn't it picked up earlier? Well, I think the attitude was when they see religiousness and spirituality, I think the idea was, well, that's not personality. So it was immediately just discarded as a non-personality term, along with other dimensions that also popped up. I mean, dimensions such as good, bad, and big and small are other dimensions that pop up in linguistic analyses when we look at all these different adjectives. Now, again, the good, bad dimension is not personality, so that's never looked at. And the size issue being fat, thin, skinny, large, all these adjectives, again, that's not personality, that's a description of size. So along with those other two dimensions, the spirituality and religiousness items also were discarded as not being personality related. Okay, but I disagree with that, obviously. And why do I disagree with that? Because when you measure the numinous, the numinous is correlated with a tremendous number of personality-related outcomes. Things like well-being, life satisfaction, interpersonal style, coping style, aspiration levels, resilience, coherence. You could just go on and on and on, that any variable that predicts all of these outcomes that are of interest to personality psychologists should be looked at and considered a personality type dimension. So that's one issue. I've also, in some of my research, shown that there's an operant quality, an operant motivation quality to spirituality. One way I've showed that is looking at, I got a group of people, several hundred people. I asked them what jobs they work in. So we assigned them to like 7 or 8 different job categories. We had like engineers and doctors, we had teachers and nurses, and we had finance people, we had people who worked in factories, etc. And what we found is that across these different groups, levels of spirituality were different. That people in the hard sciences tended to be very low on the numinous. People in the helping professions like teachers, nurses, etc., were very high on spirituality, and those in other groups were more midline across the board there. So again, there's something about our numinous motivations that points us in certain general directions in life. And that if I'm a numinously oriented person, I may want to be a therapist, or I may want to, be in a helping profession where I can be compassionate and giving and caring and try to bring the world up to where it needs to be. Also, people high in spirituality have different spending patterns for their money than people low on the numinous. People who are high on the numinous obviously are much more likely to donate money to worthy causes. That if they got extra money, they donate some money. People low on spirituality, they get extra money, they'd either save it or they'll go on a vacation. So it's a very different orientation to life based on where you stand on the numinous. And based on those data, I've concluded, it's a working hypothesis, that the numinous is a personality dimension. It is a non-specific affective force that drives, directs, and selects our behavior. It's an operant motivation, and as such, needs to be studied by personality psychologists.
How has this been received well, I'm interested in both scientific and religious circles. I can imagine it's a position that grates against both.
It's a very it's a wow. How much time do we got here? Because
Not
we can,
enough.
I know we can certainly talk. It depends on who you speak to. I remember, for example, I wrote a paper on my spiritual transcendence scale, the Aspires, and this study had everything in it. Okay, it had self-report data and observer rating data showing that the two converge. So what people say about themselves and their spirituality agrees with what knowledgeable observers of those people have to say about their spirituality. What does that tell me? It tells me, number one, that spirituality is not in the mind of people, but finds expression in people's behaviors. So much so that observers can identify these behaviors as being spiritual in nature, which means that there's a consensual understanding among all people of what spirituality really is. So there's something there that everybody agrees on is spiritual in nature. I've also got a US sample. I also got an international sample of Filipinos, and retest data, structural equation modeling. This was the ideal test to show that this numinous scale predicts important psychological outcomes over and above personality, both in the US and in a foreign sample, both in self-report data and in observer rating data. I mean, and has some causal background to it, potential to it. So I sent it to a journal on measurement, and you always know that this is going to be a bad day when you get 3 reviews back, and each review is 2 to 4 pages, single space with comments. Okay, and they rejected the paper, and it was just filled with stupid comments. Like, for example, I study mediation, and basically I like to show that spirituality predicts outcomes over and above whatever contribution the big 5 makes. So it's got incremental validity. I was told that statistically, you can never show mediation analyses. I was like, well, obviously you're not reading the literature. I got another person saying, this cross-cultural data is really not cross-cultural at all because most of the people in the Philippines are Catholic. Most of your sample in the US are Christian or Catholic. So this is just about Catholicism. And it's like, well, that's like saying that the cross-cultural research on gender differences is really useless because it's all about men and women. It's like it's about cultural influences, and that the Philippines is a collectivistic culture. The US is an individualistic culture. Do they have the same faiths? They can all be Christian, but how they understand Christianity is very different from one another. But yet the numinist predicts for both. So it's filled, people get very upset and they find stupid reasons to reject your paper. And when I went through, I wrote a letter back to the editor, and I went point by point by point through each of the reviewers saying, are you really going to say that this is true? Are you really saying that that's true and that's true and that's true? And it was to no effect. But, so there are people who push back on it. But then again, there's a growing force now in the world that spirituality, that genie's out of the box. There's just too much data out there that shows the value of spirituality for people to be prejudiced in just dismissing it out of hand. And in fact, one place of encouragement is that the National Institute of Health, which is one of the leading scientific organizations in the US, has now started a working group on spirituality and are looking to find ways to understand the numinous and how to bring that systematically into the research endeavor of the National Institute of Health. And in fact, there's a video out there by I'm blocking on his name, but the director of the NIH gave a talk for this group who said that, being a man of faith and being a scientist are not incompatible realities, and that, we can study this and look at the value of science, the scientific value of religion and spirituality, and to be complete and comprehensive in our work, we need to bring that into the research process. So, you got the whole gamut there on where it's going, but it's certainly moving ahead. It's certainly important issue. And if somebody wants to have a comprehensive model of psychology, human psychology, if it does not include the numinous, it cannot be seen as comprehensive. That's my opinion on that.
Well, we're rapidly coming up on time, and maybe that to be continued is a nice place to leave it for today.
Okay, that sounds fine. Do you have any other questions I could answer for you?
Yeah, plenty. I'd love
Well,
I'd
do one
love
more.
to. Well, yeah, the probably the main two things that I was thinking about that we haven't covered yet is how what's the factor structure of the numinous when you look at it against the big five, and what domains traditionally considered as part of spirituality aren't there and might be related to other traits as well, and then also diving into clinical and just like the place of the numinous in clinical practice. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
We
I
could
don't know
do
if you
that.
want to do that another day or if
We
we
can
have
do
time.
both of those, not a problem. The
Okay.
factor structure is very straightforward. The numinous is a single dimension, a single multifaceted dimension, just like the other factors of the big five. If we use the Neo3 as our icon here, the Neo is organized as each of the five factors, but within each factor, there's 6 facet scales. These facet scales provide a more precise articulation of the qualities that are part of each of those domains. So for example, we can talk about neuroticism, which looks at negative affect. Well, you have the facet scales of anxiety, hostility, depression, impulsiveness, self-consciousness, and coping ability. Okay, all of these are all related to one another. They all have negative affect, but they do represent different facets to that expression of negative affect. Well, the numinous 2 is a multifaceted dimension. So and I could certainly send you some articles on this, when I factor analyze the numinous scales along with the big five, I get a very clean 6-factor model. Okay, and on the 6th factor are all the numinous scales that are independent of the other 5. So it has the same structure as the other 5 dimensions of personality, which is a good thing. Symmetry is good. From a clinical perspective, this is really an important area to look at. And this is like the growing edge of the field, in that there are, just like with openness to experience, there are personality disorders out there waiting to be classified, okay, because of their relationship to the openness. Like I say, the odd and unusual, the alexithymic, these are disorders that need to be classified, that are out there, that our nosology needs to be expanded. So too with the numinous. When we bring in the numinous dimension, it's another aspect that has, as we talk about the lack of worthiness, there are disorders out there that are need to be classified, that are coming off of this lack of worthiness issue. For example, today we have the United States, we have a lot of our troops are coming back from the Middle East, from Afghanistan and Iraq. They're coming back again with psychological problems. People like to think it's PTSD, and for many it is. But there's a whole group of soldiers coming back who seem to have PTSD symptoms, but they're not responsive to it. So they've come up with a new category now called moral injury. These are people that, when you go into combat, you see things that you're not going to see anyplace else. They're frightening. They're catastrophic. They literally are just beyond things that maybe you and I can imagine seeing. The death, the destruction, the wanton killing. That blows people's minds, and that's where PTSD comes from. A lot of times, it's just being overwhelmed by these really emotionally hypercharged experiences. But then there's those people that go a little bit differently on this. Did you see the movie American Sniper? Does that
No.
ring a bell? Oh. This is a very interesting movie because it's the story of an American sniper who was over in Iraq. And his job, he would go onto a rooftop, and when the troops went out to inspect the town, he's up there watching to see if there's any bad guys. And if they are, he takes them out. Okay. And this one event that was very poignant, and people have had similar events that's created the moral injury, was that he was up there watching it one day, and while his soldiers were going house to house, he noticed down the street that a woman and a small child came out of the house and started walking down the street towards the troops. The woman took out from underneath her cloak an explosive device that she was going to throw at the soldiers there. But before she could do it, he shot her and killed her right there so that she wouldn't do it. But then the 6-year-old child with him, he picked it up and he started going towards the soldiers to throw it at them, to finish the job. And now that's an interesting dilemma. What do you do? It's a 6-year-old little boy who's carrying an explosive device that he's going to try and kill some of your American buddies with. What do you do? Well, what the sniper did is he put a bullet in the kid's head and stopped the threat. That's a terrible thing. Now, for this guy, it didn't seem to bother him much, but I know from talking to other veterans, things like that does bother people. You see yourself as a good person. I see myself as a good person. All of our soldiers see themselves as a good person. They're out there trying to do something good and noble, defending their country, extending liberty, etc. But here I am put into a position where I have to kill a civilian, a child, or a mother. How do I rectify that in my mind? How does that make sense to me as being the good person? I'm a man, I'm a believer, I believe in God. I go to church, I have values and morals. I would never think of killing a child, but yet I did. Moral injury comes out of this sense that people have compromised, either because they themselves chose it, or they were compelled to do it, or they allowed somebody else to do it. Tragic events that just violate their essential self of meaning and value and ethics. That's moral injury. That's a tremendous existential crisis that's hard to deal with, that's not going to be responsive to normal treatments with PTSD. And I think there's a number of different disorders out there that are all related to lack of worthiness. Moral injury is one. I think body role dysphoria, women who are, have eating disorders, okay, that's a worthiness issue. Substance abusers, that's a worthiness disorder. Suicidality, that's another moral worthiness issue. So until we really fully embrace the psychological value of the numinous, we're really never going to get a better handle on some of these kinds of disorders unless we begin to speak about that capacity of us to become transcendent, to understand ourselves in this broader eternal time frame that we construct for making meaning in our lives. So clinically, this is the growing edge. In fact, I'm working with colleagues now. We want to develop intervention programs that will systematically bring in the numinous as part of not only the diagnostic process, but also for the treatment process and understanding outcomes as well. So without the numinous, psychology will hobble along. The excitement about the numinous is that it adds a whole new dimension to personality that really has not been considered at all by the field of psychology whatsoever. And I think there's the potential for a great revolution in our thinking about people, who we are, what it is that makes us essentially a human being, how we are different from every other animal. The numinous will be able to provide important insights and hopefully answers to a lot of those questions.